In the spring of 1942, a global war narrowed suddenly to a single, unforgiving question: could a nation be supplied by air alone? When Japanese forces captured Rangoon on the 8th of March 1942, the last effective port feeding China was lost. Ships could no longer unload fuel, ammunition, and machines destined for the Chinese interior. The road that had carried supplies inland from Burma fell silent almost overnight. What remained was distance, hostile terrain, and the sky. For China, this was not an abstract crisis discussed in distant headquarters. Since 1937, it had absorbed the full force of Japanese invasion, tying down large numbers of enemy troops that might otherwise have been deployed elsewhere in the Pacific. Its continued resistance mattered deeply to Allied strategy. If China collapsed, Japan would gain freedom of movement across Asia, yet geography offered no mercy. Enemy-controlled coastlines sealed the east. To the south, the Burma Road, an improvised lifeline cut through jungle and mountains, had once linked China to India. With Rangoon gone, that road became unreachable. China was still fighting, but it was isolated. The problem confronting Allied planners was brutally simple. Modern war consumed material at a relentless pace. Aircraft fuel, spare parts, radios, medical supplies, and ammunition were not luxuries. They were the minimum requirements for staying in the fight. Without a steady flow of supplies, airfields would fall quiet, factories would slow, and armies would retreat, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they could no longer function. Courage alone could not fill empty depots. In the weeks after Rangoon's fall, an idea once seen as risky was pushed to the center of strategy. Supplies would be flown from Assam, in northeastern India, over the Eastern Himalayas, and down into southwestern China. The route had existed before in a limited and cautious form. Now it was expected to carry the weight of an entire nation's survival. What had once been an experiment became a necessity. At first, the language surrounding the plan was careful. The airlift was described as a temporary solution, an emergency measure meant to hold China together until a land route could be reopened. But the scale of need quickly made this description unrealistic. Aircraft of the early 1940s were not designed to replace roads. Their payloads were small, engines sensitive to altitude, and range limited by fuel and weather. To keep China fighting, thousands of tons would have to cross the mountains every month. The mountains themselves were more than a physical barrier. The Eastern Himalayas formed a wall of extreme altitude and violent weather. Warm air rising from the plains collided with cold air spilling down from the Tibetan plateau, creating storms that formed quickly and without warning. Cloud layers stacked upon one another, hiding ridgelines that rose higher than the safe flying limits of many transport aircraft. Navigation relied on basic calculations, fading radio signals, and maps that were often incomplete. Despite these dangers, regular flights began in July 1942. Crews gave the route a blunt name, the Hump. It was not a single pass, but a shifting network of airways stretched over peaks, valleys, and weather systems that resisted control. Every crossing demanded full concentration, strict discipline, and a measure of luck. There were no crowds and little recognition, only departure, uncertainty, and arrival, if fortune allowed. At the strategic level, disagreements appeared almost immediately. Some commanders argued that even limited deliveries were worth the risk, believing that sustaining China by air would preserve a critical front. Others were openly doubtful. They pointed to aircraft losses, mechanical failures, and the hard mathematics of fuel burned versus cargo delivered. An aircraft lost to the weather delivered nothing. A trained crew could not be easily replaced. These debates shaped how many aircraft were assigned, how often crews flew, and how much danger was considered acceptable. Early results seemed to confirm the doubts. By late 1942, monthly delivery targets were missed again and again. The aircraft vanished into the clouds and never returned. Accident reports showed a clear pattern. Weather and terrain, not enemy action, caused most losses. Ice robbed wings of lift. Turbulence overwhelmed controls. Mountains suddenly appeared from the clouds, with no room to turn away. The Himalayas were not a background to the operation. They were an active, relentless opponent. Yet the flights continued, because there was no alternative. Every successful crossing, no matter how small the load, meant something beyond its cargo. It proved the route could be flown again. It suggested that tomorrow might bring more than today. Necessity overruled efficiency. Gradually, the airlift began to change. It could no longer be treated as improvisation. Ground crews in Assam worked to keep aircraft flying in heat, mud, and shortages of spare parts. Maintenance routines tightened. Routes were studied and adjusted. Fatigue, once seen as a personal issue, emerged as a logistical danger, as real as storms. The airlift remained fragile, but it was becoming deliberate. By the end of 1942, one truth was unavoidable. An airbridge could not replace a road simply by flying harder or braver. If it was to survive, it had to be organized, standardized, and expanded with honesty about its limits. The sky had become the only road left to China, but whether that road could carry the weight placed upon it remained uncertain as the new year approached. The mountains between India and China were not silent obstacles. They shaped air, built storms, and altered weather with a force that pilots quickly learned to respect. Flying the Hump meant entering an environment where geography itself acted like an opposing army. Unpredictable, persistent, and indifferent to human effort. The enemy was not something that could be seen or fought. It was something that had to be endured. The Eastern Himalayas were unlike most mountain ranges Allied aircrews had trained to cross. Peaks rose beyond 16,000 and 18,000 feet, while nearby valleys dropped sharply, creating violent vertical air currents. Warm, moisture-heavy air surged north from the plains of India and slammed into cold air spilling down from the Tibetan plateau. The result was weather that formed rapidly and shifted without warning. A route that looked clear at takeoff could become blocked by storms before an aircraft reached the halfway point. For transport aircraft operating in 1942, altitude imposed constant limits. Many flights were forced to operate near the maximum capability of their engines, especially when carrying fuel and cargo together. Thin air reduced lift and engine power at the same time. In these conditions, small errors mattered greatly. Carrying slightly too much cargo, encountering stronger headwinds than predicted, or picking up ice along a wing's edge could turn a routine flight into a struggle to stay airborne. Icing became one of the most feared dangers. Moist air rising into colder layers could coat wings and propellers within minutes. The added weight and disrupted airflow slowly robbed the aircraft of lift. Often this loss happened gradually, without a clear warning. Crews reported situations where instruments appeared normal, even as performance declined. When a stall finally occurred, there was rarely enough altitude to recover. Turbulence posed an equal threat. Air flowing over sharp ridgelines produced powerful updrafts and downdrafts. Pilots could be lifted unexpectedly toward cloud-covered peaks or forced downward into valleys they could not see. Repeated jolts placed severe strain on airframes, increasing the risk of structural failure far from any safe landing site. Navigation made every danger worse. Without radar or satellite guidance, crews relied on basic calculations, radio beacons, and visual landmarks. Many of these landmarks were hidden by clouds for much of the year. Maps of the region were often outdated or inaccurate, especially in areas that had never been fully surveyed. Over flat land, a small navigational error could be corrected. Over the Himalayas, it could be fatal. The monsoon season added another layer of risk. Heavy rains flooded airfields in Assam, delaying takeoffs and complicating maintenance. In the air, cloud layers thickened, and visibility dropped to near zero. Storm systems stretched across entire routes, forcing crews to choose between delays that threatened supply schedules and flights that carried extreme danger. Accident reports show losses rising sharply during these months. By late 1942, clear patterns emerged. Enemy action accounted for only a small number of losses. Weather, terrain, and mechanical stress dominated the reports. Aircraft were found wrecked along ridgelines, deep in jungle valleys, or never found at all. Some crews survived crashes and waited days or weeks for rescue. Others vanished completely, their disappearance marked only by missing paperwork. These losses forced a reassessment. Early belief that skill and bravery could overcome the environment proved false. The mountains could not be defeated by experience alone. They demanded systems, better forecasting, clearer routes, and firm limits on aircraft loads. Each accident became a lesson, paid for at high cost. At the same time, pressure to deliver supplies never eased. Every ton that failed to reach China had consequences far beyond the airfields. Commanders faced a choice with no easy answer: reduce risk and accept lower deliveries, or push harder and accept the losses. The Himalayas ensured that neither option came without sacrifice. By the end of the year, one conclusion was unavoidable. The Hump was not a fixed challenge. Routes would have to change with the seasons. Aircraft selection would matter as much as pilot skill. The mountains had exposed the weakness of early planning, but they had also revealed where improvement was possible. Whether those lessons could be applied fast enough to slow the losses remained uncertain, as planners prepared for the next stage of the airlift. On the airfields of Assam, the struggle to cross the Himalayas became a matter of numbers written on loading charts. Weight, altitude, temperature, fuel, every figure mattered. Before an aircraft ever left the ground, its chances of survival were already being calculated. The earliest backbone of the Hump airlift was the C-47. Reliable, familiar, and relatively forgiving, it had proven itself in other theatres. Over the mountains, however, its limitations were quickly exposed. At high altitude, fully loaded, the aircraft struggled to climb. Crews were forced to make hard choices: fuel or cargo, range or safety. In summer heat, engines produced less power, further shrinking margins. The C-47 could fly the route, but only under carefully managed conditions, and often with payloads far below what planners wanted. As tonnage demands increased, pressure grew to introduce a larger aircraft. The C-46 appeared to offer an answer. With more powerful engines and greater payload capacity, it promised to carry heavier loads over the hump and do so more efficiently. On paper, it looked like a solution. In practice, it introduced new risks. The aircraft's systems were complex, and early versions suffered from mechanical weaknesses, particularly in fuel and electrical components. In the thin air over the mountains, those weaknesses became critical. Reports from 1942 and early 1943 reveal a troubling pattern. While the C-46 could lift more, it also failed more often. Engine fires, fuel leaks, and sudden power loss were recorded with alarming frequency. Some aircraft managed to limp back to Assam, others went down in terrain that offered little chance of survival. The aircraft was not inherently unsound, but it demanded maintenance standards and operational discipline that were difficult to achieve in the conditions available at the time. Maintenance itself became a bottleneck. Assam's airfields were strained by heat, humidity, and monsoon rains. Spare parts arrived slowly and in limited quantities. Ground crews worked long hours to keep aircraft serviceable, often improvising repairs under pressure. Every hour an aircraft spent grounded for maintenance was an hour. It was not carrying supplies, yet every shortcut taken increased the risk of failure in the air. The balance between urgency and caution was never stable. As losses mounted, comparisons between aircraft types became unavoidable. The smaller C-47 was safer but inefficient. The larger C-46 was capable but fragile. Neither fully met the demands placed upon it. Later, heavier transports would begin to appear, but during this phase of the airlift, crews and planners were forced to work with imperfect tools. The machines were always operating close to their limits, and sometimes beyond them. These limitations reshaped how flights were planned. Payloads were adjusted not only for distance but also for forecast temperatures and expected winds. Fuel calculations were conservative, further reducing cargo capacity. Routes were chosen to balance altitude against weather exposure, even if that meant longer flight times. The aircraft dictated the strategy as much as the strategy dictated aircraft use. For crews, this reality was constant and personal. Takeoff was often the most dangerous moment. Heavy aircraft clawed for altitude at the edge of performance, engines straining as the runway fell away. There was little room for error. An engine failure shortly after liftoff could leave no safe option. Once airborne, pilots monitored instruments relentlessly, aware that small changes could signal larger problems ahead. Despite these constraints, the airlift did not stop. Instead, it adapted in fragments. Lessons learned from one loss informed changes in procedures, maintenance checks, and loading practices. None of these adjustments transformed the operation overnight, but together they reduced some of the most obvious risks. The machines remained imperfect, but they were being understood more clearly. This period underscored a central truth of the hump. Technology alone could not solve the problem. Aircraft performance, no matter how improved, could not overcome poor organization, inadequate forecasting, or exhausted crews. The machines were part of a larger system, and when that system failed, even the best aircraft were vulnerable. By mid-1943, the airlift stood at another transition point. The aircraft's limitations were known, the mountains were understood, if not conquered. What remained was the question of whether these elements could be integrated into a coherent operation, one that treated aircraft not as heroic exceptions, but as components in a carefully managed flow. Without that shift, the machines flying the Hump would continue to operate at the edge, and the losses would continue to follow. By 1943, the airlift over the Himalayas faced a stark reckoning. Courage had carried it through the first months, and improvisation had kept it alive, but neither could deliver the volumes now demanded. The question was no longer whether aircraft could cross the Hump. It was whether the operation could be transformed from a series of risky flights into a disciplined, repeatable system. The shift began with an acknowledgement of failure. Accident rates were too high, tonnage was too low. Aircraft and crews were being consumed faster than they could be replaced. Reports circulating within the Air Transport Command made the pattern unmistakable. Without standardization, the airlift would grind itself down. What was needed was not another aircraft type or a single bold decision, but structure. One of the first changes came in how routes were managed. Instead of treating the Hump as a single, amorphous crossing, planners divided it into defined corridors with assigned altitudes and directional flows. Eastbound and westbound traffic were separated where possible to reduce collision risk in the cloud. Entry and exit points were formalized. What had once been a loosely shared sky began to resemble controlled airspace, even without the technology that would later make such control routine. Weather, long treated as an unavoidable hazard, became a focus of systematic study. Additional weather stations were established along the route and in forward areas. Observations were shared more rapidly, and forecasting, still imperfect, improved enough to support informed decisions. Flights were delayed or rerouted, not on instinct, but on accumulated data. This did not eliminate the danger, but it reduced the risk of blind exposure to it. Standard operating procedures were followed. Takeoff weights were more strictly regulated. Loading practices were standardized so that crews could trust the center of gravity calculations. Emergency protocols were drilled repeatedly, not because they guaranteed survival, but because hesitation further reduced the odds. These procedures imposed limits that frustrated some commanders eager for higher tonnage, yet over time they produced steadier results. Crew management changed as well. Early in the airlift, exhaustion had been treated as an individual problem, a matter of personal resilience. By 1943, fatigue was recognized as a systemic risk. Rotation schedules were formalized. Rest periods were enforced more consistently. Training emphasized instrument flying and weather judgment over bravado. Pilots were not asked to prove themselves, they were asked to last. Leadership played a role in this transformation, but not in isolation. Reforms associated with William H. Tunner, who would later be closely linked with airlift doctrine, were built upon lessons learned the hard way by those already flying the route. Efficiency gains came from cumulative adjustments rather than a single breakthrough. Every improvement was tested against the unforgiving reality of the mountains. The impact of these changes became visible in the numbers. By mid-1943, throughput began to climb more reliably. Loss rates, while still significant, stabilized. Aircraft utilization improved as maintenance schedules became more predictable. The airlift did not suddenly become safe, but it became less chaotic. Each flight fits into a larger pattern rather than standing alone. This transformation altered how the Hump was perceived. It was no longer just a dangerous crossing endured by individual crews. It was a supply line, governed by rules, forecasts, and schedules. Its success depended less on exceptional performances and more on consistent ones. The emphasis shifted from daring to discipline. Yet this progress introduced a new tension. As output rose, so did expectations. What had once been considered the maximum possible was quickly redefined as insufficient. Commanders began arguing not about whether the airlift worked, but about who should receive its output and in what proportions. The more the system proved itself, the more pressure it absorbed. By the end of 1943, the Hump had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer an experiment sustained by necessity alone. It was an operational system, fragile, costly, and still dangerous, but capable of growth. Whether that growth could satisfy the competing demands placed upon it, and whether alternatives might finally reduce its burden, would soon become the next point of contention. As the airlift grew more reliable, it became more contested. Every additional ton that crossed the Himalayas sharpened questions that had been deferred during the months of improvisation. The Hump was no longer simply about whether supplies could reach China. It was about who controlled those supplies, where they were sent, and what strategic purpose they served. Within the Allied command structure, these questions exposed deep divisions. Claire Lee Chennault, who led American air operations in China, argued that air power offered the greatest direct return on limited resources. Fuel and aircraft, he maintained, should be prioritized to support Chinese-based air operations against Japanese targets. From his perspective, the airlift existed to sustain airfields and squadrons that could strike immediately and visibly. Joseph Stilwell, commanding the broader China-Burma-India theater, saw the problem differently. He believed that China's long-term viability depended on rebuilding ground forces and reopening land communications. To him, the airlift was necessary but inefficient, a stopgap that consumed aircraft and crews for returns that could never fully meet demand. Supplies, he argued, should be directed toward building an overland route back into China, even if that meant short-term strain. These disagreements were not merely personal, they reflected incompatible strategic visions operating under a shared constraint. The airlift could not satisfy all demands at once. Allocating fuel to aircraft based in China meant less available for transport operations. Diverting supplies to ground forces delayed immediate offensive action. Each choice carried opportunity costs measured not in theory, but in sorties flown and units sustained. The opening of the Ledo Road in January 1944 appeared, at first glance, to offer a resolution. Carved through northern Burma from India toward China, it promised a land route that could carry heavy equipment beyond the capacity of aircraft. Yet its impact was gradual and limited. Early traffic was light, vulnerable to weather and enemy action, and far from sufficient to replace the airlift. Archival figures suggest that the road supplemented supply flow rather than relieving it. As a result, the hump remained indispensable even as alternatives emerged. This dual system created new pressures. Airlift tonnage continued to rise through 1944, reaching levels that had once seemed unattainable. With success came scrutiny. Reports were dissected, losses compared against outputs, and commanders pressed to justify every allocation. The airlift's achievements became both its shield and its burden. For those flying and maintaining the route, these debates were distant but consequential. Changes in priority translated into changes in cargo, schedules, and risk tolerance. A shift toward heavier loads or tighter timetables could undo months of incremental safety improvements. The system had matured, but it remained sensitive to strategic demands imposed from above. By late 1944, the airlift existed in a state of uneasy balance. It had proven that the sky could sustain a war effort, but it had also demonstrated the limits of that approach. Politics, personalities, and competing visions continued to shape how the hump was used. The question was no longer whether the airlift worked, but how much could reasonably be asked of it, and at what cost. As the war moved toward its final phase, attention began to turn to the cost more explicitly. Behind the tonnage charts and strategic arguments lay a quieter ledger, one that counted not victories or routes opened, but the strain placed on the people who kept the system moving. The losses along the hump did not come with enemy fire or battlefield headlines. They arrived quietly, recorded in maintenance logs, accident reports, and telegrams sent home. For those who served on the route, the danger was constant but impersonal, shaped by weather, fatigue, and the limits of machinery rather than an opposing force. By 1944, the scale of non-combat losses was impossible to ignore. Aircraft went missing at a steady rate, often without witnesses. Some were later found scattered across ridgelines or buried in jungle valleys. Others were never located at all. Official tallies varied, depending on how training flights and operational sorties were classified, but the pattern was consistent. The hump claimed men and machines even when the sky was empty of enemies. For flight crews, the risk was cumulative. Each crossing demanded sustained concentration over hours of instrument flying, turbulence, and uncertainty. Fatigue set in gradually, not dramatically. Judgment dulled, reaction slowed. Small mistakes, slightly late course corrections, delayed responses to icing had outsized consequences. Commanders learned that pushing crews too hard did not produce heroism, it produced accidents. Ground personnel faced a different strain. Mechanics and maintenance crews worked in punishing conditions on airfields often flooded by monsoon rains and choked with dust in the dry season. Spare parts were scarce, and improvisation was routine. Every aircraft released for flight carried the implicit trust that it would hold together under extreme stress. When one failed, the burden of responsibility lingered long after the wreckage disappeared into the mountains. The psychological toll extended beyond those directly involved in flight operations. Families waited without clear answers when aircraft failed to arrive. Notifications were delayed or incomplete, reflecting the uncertainty of the route itself. Survivors spoke of an atmosphere in which loss became expected, absorbed into routine. the absence of combat did not lessen the impact. It only made the sacrifices harder to frame. Despite these costs, the work continued. Crews flew because the system depended on consistency, and consistency depended on people showing up day after day. There were no decisive moments, no clear victories to offset the danger. Success was measured instead in continuity, the absence of interruption, the steady arrival of supplies that allowed others to fight elsewhere. This quiet endurance complicates how the Hump is remembered. It was not a story of dramatic confrontations, but of sustained exposure to risk. The men and women involved rarely described themselves as heroes. They spoke instead of routines, checklists, and habits that made survival more likely. In that discipline lies their contribution. As the war drew closer to its end, the losses did not suddenly stop. Even as Japanese resistance weakened, the mountains remained unchanged. The same storms formed, the same icing threatened wings, and the same fatigue accumulated. The human cost of the airlift persisted until the final flights. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the airlift began to wind down. Aircraft were reassigned, crews dispersed, and the skies over the Eastern Himalayas grew quieter. What remained was an open question, whether the price paid in lives and effort had justified the outcome, and what lessons such a costly achievement would carry forward into a post-war world. When the fighting stopped in August 1945, the sky over the Eastern Himalayas did not mark the moment with ceremony. There were no victory parades in the clouds, no clear line between danger and safety. The weather remained volatile, the mountains unchanged, yet the purpose that had driven thousands of flights had come to an end. Japan's surrender closed the chapter on the Hump as an active lifeline, and with it came the first opportunity to assess what the airlift had truly meant. By the war's final year, the scale of the operation bore little resemblance to its beginnings. Monthly tonnage had risen from the hundreds in 1942 to tens of thousands of tons by 1944 and 1945. Aircraft flew along defined routes, guided by standardized procedures and supported by a web of weather stations, maintenance depots, and trained crews. What had once seemed impossible had become routine, not safe, not easy, but repeatable. This achievement altered how military planners understood logistics. The Hump demonstrated that air transport could sustain large forces over vast distances when no land routes were available. It also exposed the limits of that approach. The airlift never replaced roads or ports, it compensated for their absence. Its success depended on accepting inefficiency, absorbing losses, and committing resources over time. It was a solution born of necessity, not preference. The influence of these lessons reached beyond the China-Burma-India theatre. In the years that followed, planners studying post-war challenges returned repeatedly to the experience of the Hump. When another airlift was mounted into a blockaded city in Europe, the emphasis on scheduling, standardization, crew management, and weather forecasting reflected hard-won knowledge from the Himalayas. The technology improved, but the principles remained the same. There was also a quieter legacy. The airlift reshaped perceptions of what constituted a meaningful contribution in war. It challenged the idea that decisive outcomes required direct confrontation. Over the Hump, endurance mattered more than spectacle. Progress was incremental and often invisible, measured in deliveries completed rather than enemies defeated. The absence of combat did not diminish the significance of the effort, it redefined it. For China, the airlift's impact was complex. Supplies delivered over the mountains sustained resistance and preserved Allied presence, but they could not resolve internal challenges or determine the post-war balance of power on their own. The Hump kept options open rather than deciding outcomes. Its value lay in preventing collapse, buying time at a moment when alternatives did not exist. The human dimension of this legacy is harder to quantify. Aircraft losses and crew casualties remain unevenly documented, scattered across records that classify flights differently and count absences cautiously. What is clear is that the cost was real and sustained. The airlift asked individuals to accept prolonged exposure to risk without the closure offered by conventional battle narratives. Their contribution resists simple summary. In retrospect, the Hump stands as a reminder that modern war is fought as much through systems as through combat. Victory depends on the ability to move fuel, food, and machines across hostile environments, day after day, with no guarantee of safety. The mountains over which those flights passed did not yield to courage or technology alone. They were negotiated through planning, discipline, and acceptance of loss. As the final aircraft turned away from the route and the airfields of Assam quieted, the sky ceased to be China's only road. But the idea forged there endured. The Hump proved that when geography closes every path on the ground, the air can become a lifeline. provided the cost is understood and the endurance to pay it is sustained. Remember the people and systems that carried a war across the sky when no road remained. Like the video, share it with others who care about the hidden logistics behind history, and help keep these stories alive. Subscribe for more calm, in-depth documentaries on the overlooked machinery that shaped World War II.